Hi, I'm Kevin Keller, the Pragmatic Statistician. In this episode of Street Stats, we're going to talk about a concept that seems to be a fascination to so many people. That is transformation of data. Now, transformation is an effort to take data that doesn't come from a Gaussian, that's a fancy term, normal distribution and make it look normal. Now, there are a bunch of reasons on the surface why this makes complete sense. Many statistical tests, the assumptions are normality. Many calculations, like process capability, rely on the data being normally distributed. Models often assume the data comes from normal distribution. I was lucky early in my stats career that I worked in the semiconductor industry making silicon wafers. The majority of our parameters were right skewed. That means the long tail off to the right. Even parameters that looked normally distributed actually violated the fundamental principle of statistics, meaning that they were independently and identically distributed. They violated that. We didn't have a single parameter in our business that was normally distributed. I learned quickly it doesn't matter if the data is normally distributed or not. You just need to do the right thing. And that's what today's session is all about. So, most of you going through your statistics classes, either academic or business, and especially Lean Six Sigma, focused a lot of energy on transforming data to deal with non normality. You quickly developed obsessions for looking at Anderson-Darling p-values. You blindly applied Box-Cox, Johnson-Pearson, chi-square goodness of fits to exponentials, gammas, Weibels, log normals, and a whole host of exotic distributions, which, by and large, added undue stress to your life, mass confusion in understanding exactly what was going on with your data, and slowed down the problem solving process. I could go into countless reasons as to why. I'll be here for an hour or more. So instead, let's focus on when transformation is important to consider. Deep breath. Let's fly up to 40,000 feet. The question must always be at the forefront of your mind. What is the objective of analyzing this data? Now, there are two reasons to take your skewed data and make it look normal. You are doing modeling where you are going to use confidence intervals and prediction intervals generated by that model. This is really quite important. These intervals assume the data is normally distributed. Let's go look at an example. So I'm going to go to Engine Room, and I've got a data set, and all of this data is just made up. There's nothing specific about it, industry specific. So I've got a couple of columns where the data is normally distributed, X and Y, and I've got another that I'm going to have X and then a skewed Y column. All right. So I'm going to go do a regression, and a regression is a model. So I'm going to do a simple regression, and I'm going to put in a normally distributed X and normally distributed Y. If I ran Anderson-Darling, you'd get all the statistics. Everything is great. Trust me on that one. And so now we care about a few of these graphs. And so we care about, are my residuals normally distributed? And the answer is yes. We care about this particular graph, making sure that the variation above and below the graph is kind of equidistant. Because what will happen is these prediction intervals and confidence intervals about that line will flare out in equal distances away from the center. So if your data is really tight at one end and really loose at another, it will overestimate and underestimate. But this is kind of the graph that we care about the most. And what we want to see is across the x-axis, the variation is relatively constant. And with the exception of this little point hanging out here, for the most part, the variability is constant. This is what normality does for our data. It creates equal variances across the x-axis. That's why it's important. But we often don't have normally distributed data. So let's look at an example of where we don't, but we're going to create a model. So I have a simple regression. I'm going to have, again, an x variable, and I'm going to have a skewed variable. And you'll see if I hover over that, you can see it's skewed. And I had pre-sorted this data, so some of the residuals look a little wonky, and that's okay. All right, here we go. So now you can see on, I keep clicking that. You can see on this graph that the residuals are not normally distributed. So that's a problem. And if I click on this graph down here, it's a little challenging to see. I probably could have tried to do a better job, but I'm getting a bit of a megaphone with my data. Anytime you get a megaphone where it's flaring out or flaring in, I guess that's wrong. It's coming in, that's a problem. And if you're going to be doing modeling where you need good prediction intervals and confidence intervals, you need to transform your data. And so what you can see on this particular axis or this particular graph is that the variation lower is smaller than as the variation increases. So we might have a quote unquote linear relationship between X and Y, but that variation is growing. That's a bad thing if I want prediction and confidence intervals. If I don't, then don't worry about it. All right. So we're going to do a second example. We produce a product or a service that has a specification limit or a set of specification limits, and you need an accurate estimate of how much product exceeds that specification limit. Now, the reason why is this is about economics. How much bad product are we sending to our customer at any given point? Or how much bad product are we actually producing? And so that could be extremely important for your business. It matters if I'm going to analyze this time after time after time that my formulas are correct. And if you're going to use the CPK or PPK formula, then the data has to be normally distributed. So let's go look at that. So we're going to go to engine room, close that one out. So I'm just going to use the skewed data. And we can see here that it's got a max of 16,090 and our spec happens to be 20,000. All right. And a bit, it's really, really small Anderson Darling. So I'm going to go ahead and just show you. Oops, probably, sorry. We're going to do process capability. I'm going to do it two different ways. I'm going to do, assuming the data is normal. So I'm going to put in a skew. It's a subgroup size of 1. Don't chastise me. I know there's only 28 values. You should never do this without at least 100. But we're just showing for demonstration purposes. So we do the process capability, and we get warnings that our data is not normal. And if we scroll down here, ultimately we find that we have a PPK estimate of 1.28, which means our yield is 99.99%. So if we made a 10,000 units, we would expect one out of those 10,000 to be defective. No worries, everybody goes hip hip hooray. But that might not be real. correct? So we can do it differently. We can go to process capability. This time we could select non-normal continuous. I'm going to put that same in there. And we'll do a subgroup size of 1 and an upper spec of 20,000. And I keep going and keep going. And this time it says, boy, we think you ought to choose an exponential distribution that seems to fit out well. And even though we see a gap there, our p-value of 0.935, that's well good enough for us. And so then if we start looking at our statistical results, we actually start seeing our PPK went from 1.28 to 0.67, went from 99.99% down to 99.03. So, or in terms of what we would expect, we would expect almost 1% of our product to be out of spec. So if we produce 10,000 units, we would expect 100 of them to be out of spec. That might mean something for your business. Even if you were doing 100% inspection, you're still scrapping out 100 out of 10,000 as opposed to 1 out of 10,000. Might make a difference for you. All right. So that's really it. So let's cover other situations that you run into really quickly. Now, go back a couple of minutes ago, I said skewed distributions. If your underlying distribution is symmetric, don't worry about it. Just proceed on as if it's normal. Doesn't matter if it is or isn't. If you were doing test of hypotheses, F-test, T-test, ANOVA, all that sort of different tests, if your sample size for each subgroup is greater than 30, central limit theorem kicks in. All systems go. You can use those, even though it talks about normality as an assumption. Doesn't matter. If not, if your sample size is less, then there are non-parametric tests that you can use. But now I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Once you get to a sample size of 20 or more, so we're now between 20 and 30, all the non-parametric tests go, we're just going to assume it's normal. Even though the concept of statistical process control, SPC, would lead you to believe that SPC requires normality, it's actually pretty robust. Lean Six Sigma teaching in the measure phase talks in gory detail about transformation of data to get an accurate estimate of your baseline data. Why do we need an accurate estimate of poor performance? Riddle me that one, Batman. And typically, in a Lean Six Sigma project, you are violating the fundamental assumption of independently and identically distributed data. That is far more important than if the data is normally distributed or not, and so on. The world has conspired to make your statistics learning as challenging as possible. On behalf of my industry, I apologize. So just to circle back, if you are doing modeling and you need accurate prediction and confidence intervals, transform. If you are doing capability analysis on an ongoing basis and making economic decisions about your process, transform. Otherwise, use the appropriate parametric or non-parametric test and solve your problems. So be careful out there. The streets are messy and so is data. But remember, there's always a way.